Hi, I'm Chris Howard. Welcome to Top of Mind. I want to talk a little bit today about simplicity and complexity. It's a topic that's coming up more and more for reasons that I'm going to go through, but I'm going to start in kind of an odd place. I like to try to see things when I'm traveling on business. I was in Europe several weeks ago and made a side trip to the Dutch city of Nijmegen, which is the oldest city in the Netherlands. I hadn't been there before, just thought it would be kind of an interesting change from some of the regular things that I see. And so, like I do, I went to visit some of the historic sites. And it happens that you can actually climb up into the clock tower of St. Stephen's Church, which is the main cathedral in the center of the old city. This was a city that was mostly destroyed during the Second World War. Half of the cathedral was blown apart, lost part of its roof, and so on. But I was able to climb up into the clock tower, and it was just a fascinating climb. It was good for my steps too. So fantastic workout, like 19 stories or something like that, up this really, really narrow spiral staircase. But you climb up through the bells that they use to announce mass and things like that, giant bells, and there's a whole floor of them with all the cables and mechanisms. But if you keep climbing higher, you get up into the actual clock tower, into the middle of the clock mechanism itself. And from there, you can look out over the city. But I wanted to be there at a time when the clock was going to strike an hour. So it happened to be 4 o'clock is when I chose to go up. And it was a fascinating thing because they have an old mechanism, like a mechanical device that actually is counting time and then rings the bells and takes care of not only the major hourly ring, the four, but actually there's like a little prelude bit that comes up to it and then it rings for it. So it's a fairly complicated mechanism. And so I'm watching this and sitting there with a handful of other people watching this like incredibly complex thing. It's as if you took a watch and kind of blew it out, 1,000 times to do something really simple as to ring the hour of four. Very complex device to accomplish something that's quite simple. I'm going to come back to that story at the end, but I wanted to start there because it got me thinking about what things need to be complex, how can things be simplified, and so on. Because that's something I talk with clients about all the time. Often it's a technology conversation, but not always. Sometimes it's a conversation about simplifying aspects of the business in order to accomplish different types of results. Now, you've heard me say that when you hit the trough of disillusionment on what Gartner calls the hype cycle, that's where some of the magic wears off. So you're really interested in something and it becomes very overhyped. And then eventually it falls into the trough of disillusionment. And that's where the work begins. But it also has this characteristic of that's often where things become more complex. And so you're fascinated by a trend of some kind. Let's use AI since it's still so dominant. And it seems like this magical, really easy thing, and it can do all kinds of amazing things. But once you start to work with it, you realize that it's actually hard, and there are aspects of it there that are really complicated. And so, in the case of AI, the things that are complicated are the market. So the market is like really confusing, and pricing is all over the place. It's not sure who you should work with. The technologies themselves are constantly evolving, so they haven't reached a point of stability, at least in the generative AI space, where it's really easy to understand how you would fit different pieces together. And so, because that's changing, it causes confusion. It's like super complex. So, there's that. When it gets to like retrieving data to actually create a generated response, that's also really complex. And some of that is because data is all over the place. So you need to bring it together into a place where you can actually operate on it and get better results, and so on. So what appeared to be magical actually is a lot of work. The other thing that's complex is how do you budget for it? So how much money should I be spending on it? How do I measure the results of that? All of this stuff. And that's just the nature of something new. When we encounter something new, everything seems possible. All of the stuff is laid on the table, and we're still trying to figure out how to put it together. That's the nature of the trough of disillusionment. Now, ultimately, what happens if you follow the hype cycle through is you get to a plateau of productivity. Now, there's some dynamics that happen there, and that the amount of complexity reduces. Why? Why does this happen? It happens because we figure out patterns or heuristics, ways of attenuating that complexity in order to make things easier to use. And so productivity comes with the easier application of things, like again, of technology, of funding, of change management in an organization. We learn how to deal with those things so we're not having to either reinvent them all the time or find new ways of doing them, or like everything incoming is new, because eventually that stuff calms down. So let's think about the types of things that can be simplified. And so platforms is a good example of this. The nature of a platform is that it makes things consistent. So you're able to do things, sometimes very complicated things, in consistent ways and standard ways that everybody knows how to use them. Even something as simple as definitions or taxonomy. If everybody's speaking the same language, so a simplified taxonomy, then it's much easier to communicate. What about communications themselves? So simple communications are best, even if they're about complex things. And so sometimes that's telling a story in different ways or using metaphors, depending on the audience that you have. Locations can be simplified, and that we've certainly seen this post COVID, where the amount of real estate held by most of the organizations that we serve has been reduced or consolidated. Certainly, Gartner has done the same thing. And that gives you an opportunity to actually bring different people from different teams together in a way that maybe they weren't before. So that then becomes an advantage. Things like metrics can be simplified. And believe me, I see complex metrics all the time. And what people really need are simple ones that they can understand. But sometimes the math that sits underneath those metrics can be complicated. So, in a sense, the metrics are being platformed, and so on and so on. You can think of lots of different examples. But I was also thinking about the balance of simplification and complexity, and the fact that they kind of exist in this equilibrium, but not all the time. So let me give you an example. And so, something if something new comes along that we've not experienced before, we tend to break that apart into small pieces and figure out how they work together and so on. So we've gone through this with generative AI, kind of understanding how the pieces fit together, and then realizing there are some stable pieces that have been around for a really long time. But you're examining this stuff on the surface, and it just you have to do that because it's how you understand a situation. And then eventually those become patterns. The same is true in the shift between centralization and decentralization, which again is a really super common enterprise topic. So, do I federate certain capabilities? Do I centralize them? And as most of you know, that goes in cycles. So, you go from a federated to a centralized and so on and kind of back and forth. Well, the advantage of centralization is what I've been talking about, which is you find common ways to do things. You can scale them more easily. But the advantage of federation, which feels and is actually more complicated to manage, is that you actually put solution finding closer to the problem. So new problems are emerging, like with your sales territories, for example, or your channels, or your partners, or your supply chain. You actually need to move some of that discovery and power to the edge, a federated sense, so that it can explore that problem space and then find those things that can be made common. So there's this give and take between central and decentral. And they both and they really do need to coexist in an environment. It's never quite as binary as you might think. One of my colleagues, Dave Aaron, writes about simplicity and has been over the last couple of years. He talks about this balance of simplicity and complexity, but he uses a bit more refined language in that there's bad complexity and good complexity. So, bad complexity is the kind of complexity that creates confusion and chaos and lack of productivity and loss of money and so on and so on. So, you're familiar with that. But good complexity you actually need for resilience. So, for example, multiple partners in the supply chain that may be duplicative because you actually need that resilience across the supply chain. That would be a good example. And you can think of multiple others where you actually have failover systems and so on, where in case something goes down, you have other options that are there. Too much simplicity can actually blind you from possibilities. It'll force you into a bias that actually blinds you from other things that you should be doing. So, too much simplicity can be a bad thing as well. My mantra for people is that simplicity is well managed complexity. Things will usually stay complex. What we're trying to do is to make things easier to use. And of course, we're headed into a very heavy conference season. Gartner's IT Symposium Expo is occurring around the world, beginning in the beginning of September in Gold Coast in Australia. But we have other conferences too, like our big Reimagine HR Symposium and others. So we're gathering C-level executives in to tackle problems like the ones that I'm talking about. And this idea of complexity of AI specifically will be a big part of our IT Symposium keynote and other sessions, where we're sort of facing the reality that AI is hard to implement, but it's worth it, right? So part of that is how do you manage the complexity of the AI implementation? From an HR perspective, in our Reimagine HR conferences, we'll be talking about the human powered organization. So, what is the human role in the midst of this complexity to actually make the enterprise function in a more effective way. So there's a lot coming in our conferences. There's the work from Dave Aaron and others around simplicity, and of course, continued coverage around how to execute against these very complex initiatives. So let's go back to Nijmegen and up that spiral staircase all the way up to the clock tower and the crazy mechanism that runs the bells when it strikes the hour. Um, Now, obviously, they could have replaced that, right? And so many of you, guys, as you're watching the pictures in the video, will say, "Well, why didn't they just use a digital mechanism to take care of ringing?" And a lot of churches have. Okay, I have a friend, Jack Santos, who used to be an analyst at Gartner, who in his retirement goes around and fixes clock towers in New England and kind of learns how these old mechanisms work. There's a sort of an artisan nature, an artistic nature, but it's also an interesting complex engineering problem. But that's not why they keep this mechanism in St. Stephen's. They keep it because tourists will pay to come and see it. And so you go up and you'll see it and you'll experience it and you see the levers moving and the wheels turning and so on. It's kind of fascinating that a human could build such a thing to do such a, such a task. And so I don't know whether that's good or bad complexity, but it certainly is a draw. It actually made me climb 19 stories, and I'm glad I did it because it made me think about simplicity and complexity. So what began as a conversation about simplicity became fairly complex in the end. It's just the nature of things, right? It's how our brain works. And when you're interested in a topic like I am, you kind of tend to want to tease it apart. And I'm happy to interact with any of you that are interested in this, but also would encourage you to attend events that Gartner is putting on where we're talking about topics like this in an applied sense. I'll be at IT Symposium. You can click below to find more details about that and other conferences that we're doing. But let's engage in a conversation about things like this because it's really important and it's also interesting. I'm Chris Howard. Thanks for joining me. We're Top of Mind, and we'll see you next time.